The morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site, painting the skeletal frame of the new office building in gold. Ethan Cole adjusted his hard hat and grabbed another steel beam, his calloused hands gripping the metal with practiced ease. At 34, he was the kind of man who moved with quiet confidence, every gesture deliberate, every step sure. His coworkers called him Bull, not for stubbornness, but for the way he could shoulder loads that would buckle other men. "Hey, Bull," called Tony from across the scaffolding. "Think this thing can hold your weight and mine?" Ethan grinned, tapping the platform with his boot. "Built it myself. She'll hold an elephant." The platform felt solid beneath him, 15 feet above the concrete foundation. He had installed the scaffolding himself 3 days ago, checking every bolt, every joint. Trust but verify. That was his father's motto, and it had kept Ethan alive through 12 years of construction work. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The radio crackled with classic rock, and Ethan hummed along as he positioned the beam. This was his element. Up here, surrounded by the skeleton of something not yet born, he felt like he was creating the future. Each building he helped raise would shelter families, house dreams, stand long after he was gone. It was honest work, work that left him tired but satisfied when he came home to Lucas each evening. The first sound was wrong. A groaning that didn't belong, metal straining against itself in a way that sent ice through his veins. Ethan looked down at the platform joint, saw the bolt pulling loose from its housing, time stretched like taffy. "Jump!" The word tore from his throat, but even as he shouted it, he knew it was too late. The platform tilted, steel beams sliding like dominoes. Ethan lunged toward the ladder, fingers scraping uselessly at rungs that seemed to pull away from him. The world spun, concrete rushing up to meet him as 2 tons of scaffolding followed him down. The impact was a thunderclap that ended the world. Silence, then the distant wail of sirens, growing closer. Ethan's eyes fluttered open to find himself staring at a ceiling of fluorescent lights and acoustic tiles. The hospital. His tongue felt thick, mouth dry as sandpaper. When he tried to sit up, fire exploded through his spine. "Don't move." The voice belonged to a woman in scrubs, her face kind but tired. Nurse Jenna, her badge read. "You're lucky to be alive, Mr. Cole." Lucky. The words sat bitter in his mouth. He tried to shift his legs, to find a more comfortable position. Nothing happened. He tried again, concentrating, willing his feet to move. The blanket over his lower body might as well have covered someone else's legs. "I can't." The words stuck in his throat like broken glass. Nurse Jenna pulled up a chair, settling beside his bed with practiced gentleness. "The doctor will explain everything, but I need to prepare you. The scaffolding crushed your L2 and L3 vertebrae. There's been significant damage to your spinal cord." The room tilted, though Ethan hadn't moved. "Significant damage? What does that mean?" "It means you'll never walk properly again." The words came out clinical, matter-of-fact, as if she were reading a grocery list. "Your legs, they won't be what they were, but your upper body function should remain intact. With physical therapy, you can learn to get out." The words came out as a whisper, then louder. "Get out." She hesitated. "Mr. Cole, I know this is difficult." "Get out." The shout tore something inside his chest. Jenna flinched but held her ground for a moment, her eyes sad but not surprised. She had delivered this news before. After she left, Ethan stared at the ceiling tiles until they blurred together. Somewhere in the distance, life continued. Phones rang. People laughed. Cars passed by the window. But here, in this narrow bed, time had stopped. He was no longer the man who built things, who carried his weight and more. He was broken. Useless. The wheelchair arrived the next day, chrome and black vinyl, squeaking slightly when it moved. Ethan refused to look at it for hours, as if ignoring it might make it disappear. But eventually, with the help of 2 orderlies and a physical therapist whose name he immediately forgot, he transferred from bed to chair. The world looked different from 3 feet off the ground. Doorknobs seemed higher. People's faces, when they bothered to look down at him, carried expressions he'd never seen before. Pity, discomfort, relief that it wasn't them. A little girl in the hallway stared openly until her mother hurried her away with hushed apologies. That night, Lucas came to visit. 10 years old, all knees and elbows, his sandy hair falling across his forehead the way it had since he was small. He stood in the doorway uncertain, as if the man in the wheelchair might be a stranger wearing his father's face. "Hey, buddy," Ethan said, trying to make his voice sound normal. Lucas approached slowly, his eyes flicking between Ethan's face and the wheelchair. "Does it hurt?" "No," Ethan lied. "Not anymore." They sat in silence for a while, the space between them feeling vast and unbridgeable. Finally, Lucas climbed into the visitor's chair and pulled out a drawing he'd made in school. It showed two stick figures, one tall and one small, standing in front of a house under a smiling sun. "That's us," Lucas said quietly, "at home." Ethan studied the drawing, noting that both figures stood on two legs. In Lucas's world, his father was still whole, still the hero. The weight of that expectation pressed down on Ethan's chest, like the scaffolding all over again. "I love it," he whispered, though the words felt like stones in his throat. Home felt like a museum dedicated to the man Ethan used to be. The stairs he'd climbed without thought now loomed like a mountain range. The kitchen counter, perfect height for a standing man, now required him to crane his neck upward like a child. Even the bathroom had become an enemy, its narrow door frame barely accommodating his wheelchair. Every simple task transformed into an elaborate negotiation with physics and pride. The worst part was the sound, or rather the absence of it. Where once his work boots had announced his presence with confident steps across the hardwood floors, now there was only the soft whisper of rubber wheels and the occasional squeak of bearings that needed oil. He moved through his own house like a ghost, present but not quite there. Lucas tried to help in the way children do, with more enthusiasm than skill. He would drag chairs across the room so Ethan could transfer to them, fetch things from high shelves without being asked, hover nearby with the anxious energy of someone waiting for disaster. The boy's constant vigilance was both touching and devastating. At 10, Lucas had appointed himself as caretaker, a role reversal that made Ethan's chest tight with shame. "I can get it, Dad," Lucas said one morning, scrambling to retrieve a dropped coffee mug before Ethan could maneuver his chair into position. The ceramic had shattered across the kitchen tile, dark coffee spreading like an accusation. "Just leave it," Ethan snapped, more harshly than he intended. Lucas froze, still crouched among the debris, his face stricken. "I'm sorry, buddy, I can clean up my own messes." But even that simple task took 20 minutes of careful maneuvering and awkward angles that left his back screaming and his dignity in tatters. The neighbors meant well. They brought casseroles and offered help with the knowing smiles of people who felt sorry for you. Mrs. Henderson from next door had key to the house now, letting herself in to do laundry and tidy up, while making small talk that felt like walking on broken glass. "You're looking well, Ethan," she would say, though her eyes said otherwise. Such a blessing that it wasn't worse. A blessing. As if being partially paralyzed was a gift he should unwrap with gratitude. It was the whispered conversations that cut deepest. People thought he couldn't hear them, or maybe they simply didn't care. Outside the grocery store, waiting in his adapted van while Lucas ran in for milk. "Poor thing," one voice said. "Strong as an ox he was, now look at him." "Shame about the boy," another replied. "Growing up with a father who can't, well, can't provide, can't protect, essentially useless." Useless. The word lodged itself in his brain like a splinter, working deeper with each passing day. He was useless. He couldn't work, couldn't fix the leaky faucet in the bathroom, couldn't even reach the cereal on the top shelf for his son's breakfast. The disability checks covered the basics, but barely. The savings account was shrinking while the bills kept coming. Physical therapy 3 times a week became a ritual of small humiliations. The exercises meant to strengthen his remaining mobility felt like cruel jokes. Walking between parallel bars for 10 feet left him exhausted and shaking. Balance exercises on a foam pad sent him tumbling more often than not. Other patients in the clinic moved around him like he was furniture, focused on their own recoveries, their own private battles with bodies that had betrayed them. Dr. Caroline Mendez, his physical therapist, was kind, but relentlessly practical. She spoke in terms of realistic goals and manageable expectations, her voice warm but firm when she guided him through each session. "Focus on what you can do, not what you can't," she would say, steadying him as he practiced transfers from wheelchair to mat. Independence comes in many forms. But independence felt like a foreign concept when he couldn't even shower without a specially installed chair and grab bars that advertised his limitations to anyone who entered the bathroom. The evenings were the hardest. Lucas would do his homework at the kitchen table, while Ethan sat nearby, trying to help with math problems that seemed to grow more complicated each day. Not because the mathematics had changed, but because holding his son's attention while seated at eye level with his textbook felt like performing from the wings of his own life. One evening in October, rain drumming against the windows with the promise of winter, Lucas closed his homework folder and turned to face his father with the serious expression he wore when working up the courage to ask difficult questions. "Dad?" His voice was small, uncertain. "Yeah, buddy?" Lucas fidgeted with the corner of his notebook, not meeting Ethan's eyes. "Tommy Henderson's dad is teaching him how to throw a football. Real throws, not just catching." Ethan's chest tightened. He knew where this was going, could see the question forming behind his son's careful words. "That sounds fun," he said, though the words felt like sand. "Yeah." Lucas was quiet for a long moment, then looked up with those wide eyes that had always been able to see straight through to Ethan's heart. "Dad, will you ever be strong again?" The question hung in the air like smoke, filling the space between them with everything that had changed and everything that might never be the same. Ethan stared at his son, this beautiful boy who still looked at him like he might have answers, might still be capable of miracles. "I don't know," he whispered, the honesty tasting bitter. "I don't know, Lucas." That night, after Lucas had gone to bed, Ethan sat alone in the living room staring at the family photos on the mantel. Images of himself at construction sites, muscles straining as he lifted beams into place. Pictures from company picnics where he'd won arm wrestling contests and carried laughing children on his shoulders. Photos of him teaching a 5-year-old Lucas to swing a baseball bat, both of them grinning in the summer sun. "Will you ever be strong again?" The question echoed in the silence, unanswered and enormous. Outside, the rain continued its steady percussion against the glass, washing the world clean while everything inside remained broken and still. The physical therapy center smelled of disinfectant and determination, a sterile space where broken bodies came to bargain with gravity. Ethan had been coming here for 6 weeks now, 3 times a week, marking small victories measured in degrees of motion and seconds of balance. Today felt different, though he couldn't name why. Perhaps it was the way autumn light slanted through the high windows, or the fact that Lucas had drawn him a new picture that morning, stick figures playing catch under a crooked sun. Dr. Caroline Mendez guided him through his warm-up routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who had seen every variation of human stubbornness. She was younger than Ethan had expected when they'd first met, maybe early 30s, with intelligent eyes and hands that were gentle but uncompromising when they needed to be. "Let's work on your standing balance today," she said, positioning the parallel bars. 5 seconds longer than last week." Ethan transferred from his wheelchair and gripped the bars, feeling the familiar fire shoot up his spine as he pulled himself upright. His legs trembled beneath him, weak and unreliable, but they held. Barely. He focused on a point on the far wall and counted heartbeats, pushing past the moment when his body wanted to collapse. "Good," Dr. Mendez said when he finally lowered himself back down. "You're getting stronger." Stronger. The word sat strangely in his mouth. He was getting better at managing his limitations, yes. More skilled at working within the narrow boundaries of what remained possible. But stronger? Real strength felt like a concept from another lifetime. "Dr. Mendez," he said, surprising himself with the words, "can I ask you something?" She settled into the chair beside his wheelchair, giving him her full attention. "Of course." Ethan stared at his hands, scarred from years of construction work, still capable of gripping and holding but no longer able to carry what they once had. "What's the strongest you've ever seen someone like me get? I mean, really get?" Her expression grew cautious. "That's a difficult question to answer without specifics. Everyone's injury is different, everyone's recovery. I want to deadlift 500 pounds. The words fell into the space between them like stones into still water. Dr. Mendez blinked, her professional composure flickering for just a moment before reasserting itself. "Ethan," she said carefully, "I understand that you're looking for goals, and that's wonderful. But we need to focus on realistic." "I used to lift 600, he interrupted. "Before the accident. I know what my body was capable of." "Was capable of," she repeated gently. "Your spine has sustained significant trauma. Your lower body strength is severely compromised. The risk of further injury." "I'm not asking if it's safe," Ethan said, leaning forward in his chair. "I'm asking if it's possible." Dr. Mendez was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against her clipboard. Around them, the therapy center hummed with quiet activity. Elderly patients working on balance exercises, stroke survivors relearning to walk, athletes recovering from torn ligaments. Everyone fighting their own private war against bodies that had betrayed them. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why 500 pounds specifically?" Ethan thought of Lucas's question, the way it had lodged itself in his chest like a fishhook. "Will you ever be strong again? My son asked me something the other night." And I realized I didn't have an answer. Maybe I don't need to be who I was before, but I need to be something. Something that shows him that strong doesn't just disappear when life knocks you down. Dr. Mendez studied his face, searching for something. Delusion, perhaps. Or dangerous desperation. Whatever she found there made her exhale slowly. "The human body is remarkably adaptable," she said finally. "I've seen people accomplish things that seemed impossible. But Ethan, the risk—" "Everything worth doing has risk," he said. "Building a house, raising a child, getting up in the morning when the world tells you you're useless. I'm asking for your help, not your permission." She was quiet again, and Ethan could see her weighing professional caution against something else. Maybe hope. Maybe the recognition of a man who had already lost everything and was trying to build something new from the wreckage. "If you're serious about this," she said slowly, "and I mean truly serious, not just caught up in a moment of inspiration that will fade when the work gets hard, then you need to understand what you're asking for. The training would be brutal. We'd have to completely rebuild your approach to movement, strengthen muscle groups you've never thought about, develop balance and coordination that works with your current limitations, not against them. I'm serious. It would take months, maybe longer, and even then there's no guarantee. Your body might simply not be capable of it anymore. Maybe, but maybe it is." Dr. Mendez set down her clipboard and looked at him directly. "Why 500? Why not 300? Or even 250? Those would still be impressive numbers for someone with your injury." Ethan thought about the whispered conversations outside the grocery store, the word useless following him home like a shadow. He thought about Lucas watching other fathers throw footballs and teach their children to be strong. "Because 500 is what I need to lift to prove to my son that his father isn't broken," he said quietly. 300 is compromise, 500 is proof." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Around them, the therapy center continued its quiet chorus of recovery. Machines beeping, weights clicking, patients breathing hard as they pushed against their own limitations. "There are things I can teach you here," Dr. Mendez said finally, "but if you really want to pursue this, you're going to need more than parallel bars and balance exercises. You're going to need a real gym, with real weights." "Where?" She smiled, and for the first time since they'd started working together, it reached her eyes. "I know a place, but I should warn you, the owner isn't exactly known for his patience with people who waste his time." "I won't waste his time." "No," she said, studying his face again. "I don't think you will." That night, Ethan sat at the kitchen table while Lucas worked on his spelling homework. The boy wrote carefully, tongue poking out slightly in concentration, erasing and rewriting words until they met his own exacting standards. When he finished, he looked up at his father with eyes that held a question he was too young to articulate. "Lucas," Ethan said, "how would you feel about coming to watch me work out sometime?" The boy's face lit up with an expression Ethan hadn't seen in months. "Really? Like at a real gym?" "Like at a real gym!" Lucas bounced in his chair, then grew serious. "Are you going to get strong again, Dad?" Ethan reached across the table and took his son's hand, feeling the smallness of it, the trust in those thin fingers. "I'm going to try, buddy. It might take a while, and it might be really hard, but I'm going to try. Will you be able to carry me on your shoulders again?" The question pierced something deep in Ethan's chest. He wanted to promise, wanted to give his son certainty and hope wrapped up in easy answers. Instead, he squeezed those small fingers and chose honesty. "I don't know about that, Lucas. My body might not work the same way it used to. But there are different kinds of strong, and I think I might be able to show you one of them." Lucas nodded solemnly as if accepting a sacred trust. "Okay, Dad, I'll help you get strong." Later, after Lucas had gone to bed, Ethan sat alone in the living room and let himself imagine the impossible. 500 pounds. The weight of possibility balanced against the certainty of pain. Tomorrow, he would call Dr. Mendez and get the name of that gym. Tomorrow, he would begin the long journey toward an answer for his son's question. Tonight, for the first time in months, that felt like enough. The gym sat wedged between a pawn shop and a used tire store on the industrial side of town, its windows painted black and its sign reading simply "Irons" in faded red letters. From the parking lot, Ethan could hear the rhythmic clang of weights hitting plates, the sound of serious work being done by serious people. His van's wheelchair lift lowered him to the cracked asphalt with a mechanical whir that felt too clean, too medical for this place. Dr. Mendez had warned him about Marcus Daniels. "He's not cruel," she'd said, "but he doesn't coddle anyone. If you're looking for encouragement and positive affirmations, you're in the wrong place. If you want someone who'll push you past what you think is possible, Iron's your man." The door was heavy, steel reinforced and marked with dents from years of equipment being moved in and out. Ethan struggled with it for a moment before a thick-armed woman in a tank top pushed it open from the inside, nodding at him without comment as she headed to her car. No offers of help, no pitying looks, just business. Inside, the gym was a temple to iron and sweat. Chalk dust hung in the air like incense, and every surface bore the honest wear of serious use. The walls were lined with photos of powerlifters in competition, their faces twisted with effort as they moved weight that seemed to defy physics. No mirrors, no bright lights, no motivational posters, just barbells and plates, and the kind of silence that came from people too focused to make small talk. Marcus Daniels stood behind the front counter, a man who looked like he'd been carved from granite and left to weather in the elements. 60-something, with silver hair cropped close and forearms that spoke of decades spent gripping heavy things. He didn't look up from his clipboard when Ethan approached. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You the guy Caroline called about?" Marcus asked, still writing. "Yes, sir, Ethan Cole." Now Marcus looked up, his eyes taking in the wheelchair, the atrophied legs, the hopeful expression of a man who might be kidding himself. "She says you want to deadlift 500 pounds. "That's right." Marcus set down his pen and studied Ethan with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen every variety of human ambition walk through his door. "What did you pull before?" 600, sometimes 650 on a good day. "And now?" "Now I can barely stand for 30 seconds. A ghost of a smile crossed Marcus's weathered face. "At least you're honest. Most people come in here telling me what they used to be able to do like it means something today. Yesterday's strong doesn't buy you today's lift." Around them, the gym hummed with quiet intensity. A woman with arms like tree branches worked through a set of squats that made the floor vibrate. Two men spotted each other on bench press, communicating in grunts and nods. Everyone moved with the economy of motion that came from years of practice. 500 is a lot of weight, Marcus continued, even for someone who still has working legs, for someone in your situation. He shrugged. Might as well wish for wings. The words stung, but Ethan had expected them. He'd heard variations of the same sentiment from every medical professional he'd encountered since the accident. "Dr. Mendez thought you might be willing to let me try." "Oh, I'll let you try," Marcus said, coming around the counter. "But I've got rules. First rule, no excuses. I don't want to hear about your bad days or your pain levels or how the weather makes your back ache. Every lifter deals with pain. Yours isn't special." "Understood." Second rule, you work my program my way. I don't care what you read on the internet or what some other trainer told you. You want to train here, you do what I say when I say it. "Yes, sir." Third rule, no drama. This isn't group therapy. People come here to lift heavy things and go home. They don't need to hear your sob story or be your cheerleading squad. Marcus gestured toward a corner of the gym where lighter weights sat unused. You start there. Today, we see what you can actually do, not what you think you can do or what you used to do. reality check comes first. The next hour was a masterclass in humility. Ethan transferred from his wheelchair to a specially positioned bench and attempted to deadlift 45 pounds. Just the bar. His hands shook, his back screamed, and his legs felt like they might collapse at any moment. He managed 3 repetitions before his form fell apart completely. Marcus watched without comment, occasionally adjusting Ethan's grip or foot position with economical movements that spoke of decades of coaching. When Ethan finally collapsed back into his wheelchair, soaked in sweat and breathing hard, Marcus simply noted something on his clipboard. "Pathetic," said a voice from across the gym. Ethan looked up to see a young man, maybe 25, built like a linebacker and wearing the kind of smirk that suggested he'd never failed at anything physical in his life. "Maybe try Planet Fitness. I hear they have good smoothies." The gym went quiet. Even the woman doing squats paused mid-representative to watch what would happen next. Marcus set down his clipboard and walked slowly toward the young man, who suddenly looked less sure of himself. "What's your name?" Marcus asked quietly. Brad." "Well, Brad, since you seem to have time to offer commentary instead of focusing on your own workout, why don't you show us what you can do?" Same weight, same position. Brad glanced around the gym, realizing that all eyes were now on him. "I don't need to prove." 45 pounds, Marcus repeated. "From a seated position. Let's see it." Brad approached the barbell, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. He sat on the bench, gripped the bar, and pulled. The weight came up easily, but his form was sloppy, his back rounded, his legs doing most of the work. After 5 repetitions, he stood and shrugged as if it had been nothing. "Now do it again," Marcus said, "but this time, strap your legs down so they can't help." The color drained from Brad's face. That's exactly what he's dealing with every day," Marcus cut him off. "Dead weight below the waist, nothing but upper body and core to move the load. Still think it's pathetic?" Brad mumbled something about needing to finish his own workout and retreated to the other side of the gym. Marcus returned to Ethan without acknowledging the exchange. "Same time Thursday," he said. "We'll add 5 pounds." As Ethan loaded his wheelchair into the van, he noticed a small figure pressed against the gym's painted windows. Lucas, barely visible through a gap in the black paint, had somehow convinced his after-school babysitter to bring him here. The boy's eyes were wide with wonder, watching his father in this alien environment of iron and sweat. Ethan waved, and Lucas waved back, his face splitting into a grin that could have powered the entire gym. For the first time since the accident, Ethan felt something that might have been pride, not for what he'd accomplished. 45 pounds was nothing, less than nothing, but for the fact that he'd started, that he'd walked into this den of serious people and declared his intention to be one of them. As he drove home, Lucas chattering excitedly in the passenger seat about the super strong people he'd seen, Ethan caught sight of himself in the rearview mirror. His shirt was soaked with sweat, his hair disheveled, his face flushed with effort. He looked like someone who'd been working, someone who was trying. "Dad," Lucas said as they pulled into their driveway, "you looked really strong in there." Ethan smiled, remembering the weight of the bar in his hands, the burn in his muscles, the quiet satisfaction of moving something heavy from point A to point B. "This is just the beginning, buddy." 3 weeks into training at Irons, Ethan's world had shrunk to the space between his wheelchair and the barbell. The gym had become both sanctuary and torture chamber, a place where he pushed his broken body against the immutable laws of physics and usually lost. His hands were raw despite the calluses, his back ached in new and creative ways, and his legs trembled with fatigue after each session even though they barely participated in the lifts. Progress was measured in 5-pound increments that felt both monumental and pathetic. 95 pounds, 100, 105. Numbers that would have been insulting warm-up weights in his former life now represented the absolute limit of what his reconstructed body could manage. Marcus watched each session with the patience of stone, offering minimal praise and maximum correction. "Your grip is slipping because you're trying to muscle through instead of setting up properly," Marcus said as Ethan failed his 3rd attempt at 110 pounds. "The weight doesn't care about your feelings. Either you're strong enough to move it or you're not." Dr. Mendez was more encouraging but equally demanding in her own way. Their therapy sessions had evolved beyond basic mobility work into something that resembled actual training. She had him doing exercises he'd never heard of, Pallow presses, dead bugs, bird dogs, movements designed to teach his core and upper body to work as an integrated unit instead of a collection of individual muscles. "Your foundation has changed," she explained during one particularly brutal session focused on spinal stability. "We're not rebuilding the same house. We're constructing something entirely new that happens to look similar from the outside." The physical exhaustion was manageable. Ethan had been tired before, had pushed his body to its limits during long days on construction sites and weekend warrior athletic pursuits. But the mental fatigue was something different, a bone-deep weariness that came from constantly translating simple movements into complex negotiations with gravity and balance. At home, the strain began to show in ways that had nothing to do with lifting weights. He snapped at Lucas over homework, frustrated by math problems that seemed designed to highlight his own limitations. When the boy struggled with fractions, Ethan found himself unable to sit still long enough to help, his mind racing with calculations about training loads and recovery times. "I don't get it," Lucas said, erasing his answer for the third time. "Just think it through," Ethan replied, his attention split between the worksheet and his own concerns about tomorrow's session. "If you have 1/2 and you need to add 1/4. "I am thinking," Lucas's voice carried a note of frustration that mirrored his father's mood. "It doesn't make sense." "Of course it makes sense. Math always makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, you're not thinking hard enough." Lucas threw down his pencil, tears threatening. "I'm trying, Dad. I'm trying really hard." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. Here was his son, struggling with a challenge that seemed impossible from his perspective, and instead of offering support, Ethan was demanding perfection. He was becoming the voice of judgment he'd been fighting against in his own head. "I'm sorry, buddy," he said, rolling his wheelchair closer to the table. "You're right. You are trying hard. Let's figure this out together." But the damage was done. Lucas completed his homework in silence, and when bedtime came, his goodnight hug felt perfunctory, obligatory. Ethan lay awake that night, wondering if his pursuit of strength was actually making him a weaker father. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in November. Ethan had loaded 115 pounds onto the bar, a milestone that should have felt significant but somehow didn't. His setup felt off from the beginning, his grip uncertain, his positioning awkward. The first pull felt wrong, the bar drifting away from his body instead of tracking straight up. The second attempt was worse, his back rounding dangerously as he fought to break the weight off the floor. "Stop," Marcus said firmly. "You're going to hurt yourself." "I can get it," Ethan insisted, even though he knew it wasn't true. "One more try?" I said stop. But Ethan was beyond listening. 3 weeks of incremental progress, of watching other lifters move weights he could only dream of lying to his son about getting stronger when every session proved how far he had to go. It all crystallized into a moment of pure, desperate fury. He gripped the bar again, set his feet and pulled with everything he had. The weight moved perhaps 2 inches off the floor before his form collapsed completely. His grip failed, the bar crashed back to the platform, and Ethan toppled sideways off the bench, landing hard on the gym floor in a tangle of wheelchair and bruised pride. The gym went silent. Every eye was on him, watching the spectacle of a broken man trying to pretend he wasn't broken. Marcus approached slowly, offering a hand up, but Ethan slapped it away. "Don't," he snarled, struggling to right himself and transfer back to his wheelchair. "Just don't." He rolled toward the exit without another word, leaving behind the stares and the whispered conversations and the weight of his own impossible expectations. In the parking lot, he sat in his van and pounded the steering wheel until his hands ached, screaming into the empty space, until his voice cracked. That night, Lucas approached carefully as Ethan sat brooding in the living room. The boy had made dinner, peanut butter sandwiches and apple slices, and set it on a TV tray beside his father's chair. "Dad?" Lucas's voice was small, uncertain. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Ethan lied, not looking up from the floor. "You seem sad." "I said I'm fine, Lucas. Just give me some space, okay?" "Are you or?" Lucas hesitated, then stepped closer instead of retreating. "I know you're trying really hard to get strong," he said quietly. "Like how I try really hard with math." Ethan looked up, seeing his son's earnest face, the careful way he was choosing his words. "It's not the same thing, buddy." Maybe not, Lucas said, but I made you something anyway. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to his father. Ethan unfolded it to reveal a drawing in crayon and marker, a stick figure in a wheelchair lifting a barbell over his head. At the bottom, in careful block letters, Lucas had written, "Super Dad." Something broke open in Ethan's chest. Not the brittle kind of breaking that had defined the last few months, but something deeper, more fundamental. He pulled his son close, feeling the solid warmth of him, the absolute trust in those thin arms wrapped around his neck. "I'm sorry I've been grumpy lately," Ethan whispered into Lucas's hair. "This is really hard for me, and sometimes I forget that doesn't mean I should be hard on you." "It's okay," Lucas said. "Mom used to get grumpy when she was sick too, but she always said the trying was what mattered, not the getting it right every time." That night, after Lucas had gone to bed, Ethan sat at the kitchen table and really looked at the drawing. The stick figure Dad was smiling. Not grimacing with effort, not straining against impossible odds, just lifting and smiling like it was the most natural thing in the world. In his son's imagination, strength and joy weren't mutually exclusive. They were the same thing. He carefully taped the drawing to the refrigerator, right next to Lucas's school schedule, and a photo from before the accident. Tomorrow he would go back to irons. He would apologize to Marcus, load 110 pounds back onto the bar, and try again. Not because he wasn't allowed to fail, but because the trying itself was what made him strong in the eyes of the person who mattered most. The weight on the bar was just weight. The love in his son's eyes, that was the real test of strength, and it was one he was determined not to fail. December brought the first snow, and something that felt dangerously close to momentum. Ethan had returned to irons the day after his breakdown with an apology from Marcus and a new perspective on failure. Instead of seeing each missed lift as proof of his limitations, he began to view them as data points in a larger experiment. His body was learning, slowly and sometimes painfully, how to be strong in ways it had never been before. "Better," Marcus said, as Ethan completed a set of 125 pounds. "Your setup is getting consistent, the weight is tracking straighter." Coming from Marcus, better was equivalent to a standing ovation. The old powerlifter was sparing with praise, but Ethan had learned to read the subtle signs of approval. The slight nod when his form held together, the way Marcus sometimes made notes on his clipboard instead of corrections, the fact that he'd started suggesting variations and accessory work instead of just focusing on the basic movement. Dr. Mendez was more openly encouraging, but no less demanding. Their sessions had evolved into something that resembled sport-specific training rather than rehabilitation. She had him working with resistance bands to strengthen his grip, doing planks and side planks to build the core stability that would protect his spine under heavy loads, practicing the hip hinge movement pattern that was crucial to deadlifting. "Your nervous system is adapting," she explained during one session as Ethan worked through a series of single-arm rows. "We're teaching your brain to recruit muscles in new ways, creating motor patterns that work with your current anatomy instead of fighting against it." The technical explanation mattered less than what Ethan could feel happening in his body. He was standing longer during transfers. His grip strength had improved enough that opening jars and carrying grocery bags no longer felt like monumental tasks. The chronic pain in his back hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted from a sharp, angry protest to something more like a constant negotiation. Lucas noticed the changes too, though he expressed them in the way 10-year-olds did, through action rather than words. He started lingering in the garage when Ethan did his home exercises, sometimes mimicking the movements with a broomstick or attempting push-ups alongside his father. The boy's enthusiasm was infectious, turning what could have been grim sessions of self-improvement into something that felt almost like play. "Are you getting stronger, Dad?" Lucas asked one evening as Ethan worked through a set of seated rows using a resistance band anchored to the wall. "I think so," Ethan replied, focusing on keeping his shoulders back and his core engaged. "It's hard to tell day by day, but when I look back at where I started." "You look stronger," Lucas said with the matter-of-fact certainty of childhood. "Your arms are bigger." Ethan paused mid-rep and looked down at himself. Lucas was right. Not dramatically. He wasn't going to win any bodybuilding contests, but there was definition in his shoulders and upper arms that hadn't been there 3 months ago. His chest looked broader, his posture more upright even when sitting. Small changes, incremental improvements that individually meant little but collectively suggested transformation. At irons, he'd begun to earn a different kind of attention. Not the pitying glances or uncomfortable stares of those first weeks, but the grudging respect that came from showing up consistently and working without complaint. Other lifters nodded when he arrived, offered spots when he needed them, included him in the informal conversations that happened between sets. "How much you pullin' now?" asked Sarah, the tree-armed woman he'd watched that first day. She was loading plates onto her own bar, preparing for what looked like a warm-up set that exceeded Ethan's current maximum. 130, Ethan replied, transferring from his wheelchair to the bench. "Working toward 135 today." She nodded approvingly. Good progression. Slow and steady. It was a small interaction, barely more than pleasantries, but it marked something significant. He was no longer the curiosity, the broken man attempting the impossible. He was just another lifter working his way up the ladder, one representative at a time. The 135-pound attempt felt different from the beginning. His setup was automatic now, his grip positioned precisely where Marcus had taught him. His shoulders set and his core braced. The weight broke off the floor cleanly, tracking straight up his shins without the drift that had plagued his earlier attempts. At the top of the movement, he stood tall, or as tall as his seated position allowed, holding the weight for a moment before lowering it under control. "That looked easy," Marcus observed, making a note on his clipboard. "It felt easy," Ethan replied, surprised by the truth of it. "Well, not easy exactly, but right, like my body knew what to do." Marcus allowed himself a rare smile. "That's what we call grooving the movement. Your nervous system is finally talking to your muscles in the same language. We can start thinking about bigger jumps now. Maybe 10 pounds at a time instead of 5. The suggestion should have felt like pressure, but instead it felt like permission. Permission to dream bigger, to set his sights on numbers that had seemed impossible just a month ago. At his current rate of progress, 200 pounds wasn't unrealistic, maybe even 250. Still far from the 500-pound goal that had started this journey, but no longer in the realm of pure fantasy. That evening, Lucas helped him plan out his training schedule for the following month, writing the numbers in careful block letters on a calendar they hung on the refrigerator next to the Superdad drawing. Seeing the progression laid out visually, 135, 145, 155, 165, made it feel real in a way that abstract goals never had. "When you get to 500, are we going to have a party?" Lucas asked. "When I get to 500, Ethan corrected gently, "we're going to have the biggest party this town has ever seen." Lucas grinned and added, "Party!" to the calendar in red marker, circling it 3 times for emphasis. Later that night, after Lucas had gone to bed, Ethan sat in his living room and allowed himself to feel something he hadn't experienced in months: pride. Not the hollow, defensive pride that came from pretending everything was fine, but genuine satisfaction in work well done. He was stronger than he'd been yesterday, and tomorrow he would be stronger still. The man in the family photos on the mantel might have been able to lift heavier weights, but he'd never had to fight for every pound the way Ethan was fighting now. He'd never had to rebuild himself from broken pieces, never had to prove that strength could exist in forms he'd never imagined. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in quiet white. Spring felt impossibly distant, but Ethan found himself looking forward to it anyway. By then, he might be lifting 200 pounds. By summer, maybe 250. The numbers themselves mattered less than what they represented. The slow, patient work of becoming someone new while honoring who he'd always been. His phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Mendez. "Saw the video Marcus sent of today's lift. Form looks excellent. You should be proud." Ethan smiled and typed back, "Just getting started." It was the truth. For the first time since the accident, he felt like he was moving forward instead of just trying not to fall behind. The mountain ahead was still massive, the summit barely visible through the clouds. But he'd found his footing on the slope, and every step was taking him higher. Word traveled fast in a small town, especially when that word involved someone attempting something that defied conventional wisdom. By February, Ethan's training had become common knowledge among the regulars at Murphy's Diner, the post office, and the grocery store, where he'd once overheard himself described as useless. Now the whispers followed a different script, though they weren't necessarily kinder. "Heard Cole thinks he's going to lift 500 pounds, Ethan overheard at the hardware store, pretending to examine screws while 2 men discussed him 3 aisles over. Poor bastard. Someone should tell him before he hurts himself worse. Maybe it's good for him, the other voice replied. Gives him something to do. Better than sitting around feeling sorry for himself. The conversations were everywhere, floating on the edges of his daily routine like smoke. At the bank, the post office, even at Lucas's school where other parents regarded him with expressions that ranged from admiration to concern to barely concealed amusement. The story had taken on a life of its own, growing in the telling until he wasn't just a man trying to reclaim some measure of strength, but a cautionary tale about the dangers of false hope. "Mr. Cole," said Mrs. Patterson, Lucas's teacher, approaching him after the school science fair, "I heard about your project. It's wonderful that you're staying active." The pause before project carried volumes. She meant well. They all meant well. But their kindness came wrapped in the assumption that his goals were therapeutic rather than serious, a form of elaborate physical therapy designed to help him cope rather than achieve. At Irons, the atmosphere was different. There, his progress was measured in concrete terms: 175 pounds, 185, 195. The numbers spoke for themselves, and the community of lifters understood effort in ways that the broader world didn't. When Sarah suggested he might be ready for a local powerlifting meet, the idea felt both terrifying and inevitable. "It's just a small competition," she explained between sets, "mostly beginners and older lifters. Nothing fancy, but it would give you a real platform, real judges, real numbers that count for something." Marcus overheard and approached with his characteristic directness. "You thinking about competing?" "I don't know," Ethan replied honestly. "Maybe." "What's your goal? Still 500? "Yes." Marcus studied him for a long moment, the way he might evaluate a piece of equipment for hidden flaws. "You're pulling 195 now. Competition is in 6 weeks. If you're serious about 500, you need to test yourself under pressure. Can't do that in here forever." The seed of the idea took root and grew over the following days. A competition would mean lifting in front of strangers, submitting his efforts to official judgment, making his private struggle public in ways that felt both exposing and liberating. It would also mean answering, once and for all, whether his goals were realistic or delusional. Lucas was unequivocally enthusiastic when Ethan mentioned the possibility. "You mean like the Olympics? With judges and everything?" "Smaller than the Olympics," Ethan laughed. "More like a local track meet, but yes, with judges and official rules." "Can I come watch?" The question stopped Ethan cold. Having Lucas witness his efforts in the controlled environment of Irons was one thing, but a competition meant the possibility of very public failure, of his son watching him collapse under weight he couldn't handle while strangers looked on. It meant risking the hero worship he saw in Lucas's eyes every time they trained together. "We'll see," he said, though he already knew the answer would be yes. This journey had started with Lucas's question about strength. It seemed fitting that his son should witness whatever answer Ethan could provide. The decision to register for the competition made everything feel suddenly urgent. 6 weeks, to add as much weight as possible to his deadlift, to perfect his technique, to prepare mentally for the most public test of his progress since the accident. Dr. Mendez adjusted his therapy sessions to focus on competition preparation, working on his setup ritual and the mental aspects of performing under pressure. "Competitions are 90% preparation and 10% execution," she explained. "By the time you step up to the bar, everything should be automatic. You shouldn't have to think about form or breathing or foot position. Your body should know what to do." The announcement that he would be competing spread through town with the speed of all interesting gossip. At Murphy's Diner, the conversation stopped when he wheeled through the door, resuming in whispers after he'd found a table. The waitress, a woman named Beth who'd been serving coffee there since Ethan was in high school, approached with obvious curiosity. "Heard you're entering some kind of weightlifting contest," she said, refilling his coffee without being asked. "Powerlifting meet," he corrected. "Down in Springfield." "That's brave of you." The word carried layers of meaning, suggesting both admiration and the kind of bravery associated with hopeless causes. But it was the conversation he overheard 2 tables away that crystallized the weight of what he was attempting. 2 men he recognized from his construction days were discussing his upcoming competition with the casual certainty of people who had never doubted their own physical capabilities. "Feel bad for the kid," one was saying. having to watch his dad embarrass himself like that. Some things you just gotta accept, you know? Move on. Should have stuck to the therapy, the other agreed. This is just sad. The words stung not because they were cruel, but because they articulated fears Ethan hadn't fully acknowledged. What if he was setting Lucas up for disappointment? What if his pursuit of strength was actually an elaborate form of selfishness, prioritizing his own need to prove something over his son's emotional well-being? That evening, as they worked through Ethan's home exercises together, Lucas seemed to sense his father's uncertainty. "Dad, are you nervous about the competition?" Ethan paused mid-rep, a resistance band stretched between his hands. "A little. It's normal to be nervous before something important. Tommy Henderson's dad says you're going to make a fool of yourself." The bluntness of childhood could be devastating in its honesty. Ethan set down the band and looked at his son directly. "What do you think?" Lucas considered the question with the seriousness he brought to all important matters. "I think Tommy Henderson's dad is scared." "Scared of what?" "Scared that if you can get strong again, maybe other people can too. Maybe he could. But it's easier to say it's impossible than to try." The wisdom of the observation took Ethan's breath away. In a few simple sentences, his 10-year-old son had identified something that had taken him months to understand: that his attempt to reclaim strength threatened the comfortable certainties of people who had accepted their own limitations as permanent. "You might be right about that, buddy." Lucas smiled, the expression bright with confidence in his father's abilities. "I know I'm right. And when you lift 500 pounds, everyone will know it too." That night, Ethan called the competition organizer and confirmed his registration. Whatever happened on the platform, whatever weight he could or couldn't lift, he would face it honestly and publicly. Not because he was certain of success, but because the trying itself had become its own form of strength. The boy who had asked if his father would ever be strong again deserved to see the answer, whatever it might be. The competitors' meeting was a blur of rules and procedures, most of which Marcus had already explained during their training sessions. 3 attempts per lift, increasing weight with each successful attempt, red lights for technical violations that seemed designed to catch every possible form breakdown. Ethan half-listened while studying the other lifters in his flight, trying to gauge his chances against men who looked far more prepared than he felt. When his name was called for his opening attempt, the noise of the crowd seemed to fade to a distant hum. Ethan transferred from his wheelchair to the competition bench positioned behind the platform, checking his grip one final time while the spotters loaded 225 pounds onto the bar. More weight than he'd ever attempted, on a platform that felt both enormous and claustrophobically small. "Take your time," Marcus said quietly. "Same setup as training. The weight doesn't know where it is." Lucas caught his eye from the competitors section and gave him a thumbs up, his face bright with absolute confidence in his father's abilities. The trust in that expression was both inspiring and terrifying, a reminder of everything that rode on the next few seconds. Ethan approached the bar with the ritual precision that months of training had ingrained, feet positioned, hands set, shoulders over the bar, lats engaged. The weight felt heavy in his grip, but not impossibly so. He took a breath, braced his core, and pulled. The bar broke off the floor cleanly, tracking straight up his shins without the drift that had plagued his early training sessions. At his knees, he drove his hips forward, standing tall as the weight reached full extension. For a moment that seemed to last forever, he held 225 pounds at the top of the movement while the judges evaluated his lift. 3 white lights. Good lift. The crowd's applause seemed to come from very far away. Marcus was saying something about the next attempt, Dr. Mendez was smiling broadly, and Lucas was cheering with the uninhibited enthusiasm of childhood. But all Ethan could focus on was the number now officially attached to his name on the scoreboard, 225 pounds. "How do you feel?" Marcus asked as they returned to the warm-up area. Ethan looked at his hands, still chalked from the lift, still steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. He thought about the man he'd been before the accident, the one who could lift 600 pounds without breaking a sweat. Then he thought about the journey from that hospital bed to this competition platform. Every painful session and small victory that had brought him here. "I feel strong," he said, and for the first time in almost a year he meant it completely. The second attempt would be 245 pounds. Then, if everything went perfectly, he would have one chance at a number that still seemed impossible, 265 pounds. Not 500, not the goal that had started this journey, but a weight that would represent something even more valuable than achieving his original dream. It would represent becoming someone new while honoring who he'd always been. The crowd had grown throughout the day, filling the bleachers with family members, friends, and powerlifting enthusiasts drawn by the drama of ordinary people attempting extraordinary things. Ethan's second attempt, 245 pounds, had gone up with surprising ease, earning another set of white lights and moving him into third place in his weight class. Now, with one attempt remaining, he faced the decision that would define not just his competition but the entire journey that had brought him here. Marcus studied the scoreboard with the calculating expression of a chess master planning several moves ahead. You could play it safe, he said. 260 would probably hold third place, maybe even move you up to second if Johnson misses his final attempt. Dr. Mendez nodded agreement. 260 is a huge achievement, more than anyone thought possible when we started. The Springfield Community Center had been transformed into a temple of iron and chalk. Competition platforms occupied the main floor, surrounded by warm-up areas where lifters prepared with the focused intensity of warriors entering battle. The air hummed with nervous energy, the sound of plates being loaded and unloaded, the rhythmic slap of lifting belts being tightened, the quiet conversations of coaches offering last-minute technical advice. Ethan had arrived 2 hours early, partly for warm-up purposes, but mostly because sitting at home had become unbearable. Lucas sat beside him in the competitors section, wide-eyed at the spectacle unfolding around them. The boy wore his best shirt and the serious expression he reserved for important occasions, as if his formal attention might somehow transfer strength to his father's efforts. "Look at how much weight that guy has," Lucas whispered, pointing to a lifter loading what appeared to be close to 600 pounds onto his warm-up bar. Ethan followed his son's gaze to a mountain of a man who moved with the casual efficiency of someone for whom heavy lifting was as natural as breathing. The lifter's arms were the size of Ethan's torso, his back so broad it seemed to block out the light. This was what serious powerlifting looked like, what real strength resembled when uncompromised by injury or circumstance. "Different weight classes," Dr. Mendez said, appearing beside them with her coach's credentials hanging around her neck. "You're not competing against him. You're competing against yourself and the other lifters in your division." She was right, technically. The competition was divided by weight class, age, and experience level, putting Ethan among novice lifters in the 181-pound category. But watching the elite competitors move through their warm-ups felt like being reminded of everything he'd lost, every capability that the accident had stolen. Marcus arrived with his characteristic punctuality, carrying a duffel bag full of equipment, and wearing the expression of a man who had prepared for every possible contingency. He'd insisted on serving as Ethan's handler, managing his warm-up schedule and equipment between attempts, translating the arcane rules of powerlifting competition into actionable strategy. "How you feeling?" Marcus asked, settling into the chair beside Ethan. "Terrified," Ethan replied honestly. "Good, means you care." Marcus pulled out a clipboard, covered in calculations and timing notes. "We've got 2 hours until your flight starts. Plenty of time to warm up properly, get your opener dialed in." The opener. They'd spent weeks discussing this lift, the weight that would officially enter him into the competition, and, hopefully, build confidence for the heavier attempts that would follow. 225 pounds. More than he'd ever lifted in training, but within the realm of possibility if everything went perfectly. Around them, the warm-up area filled with lifters preparing for their events. Ethan watched a woman who couldn't have weighed more than 120 pounds pulling 300 with perfect form, her technique so refined it looked effortless. A teenager, probably not much older than Lucas would be in a few years, worked up to 400 pounds with the kind of casual confidence that suggested he'd been lifting seriously since middle school. "Dad," Lucas said quietly, "everyone here is really strong." "Yes, they are. Are you strong enough?" It was the same question Lucas had asked months ago, the one that had started this entire journey. But now, surrounded by legitimate powerlifters and faced with the imminent test of everything he'd worked toward, Ethan found he had a different answer. "I'm strong enough to try," he said, "and right now, that's all that matters." The warm-up went better than expected. 135 moved like an empty bar, 165 felt solid, and 185 pulled smoothly despite the unfamiliar platform and the distraction of other competitors working around him. Marcus made small adjustments to his setup, reminding him to keep his chest up and his lats engaged, but offered no major corrections. "Looks good," Dr. Mendez observed as he completed his final warm-up. "Your technique is holding together under pressure." But Ethan wasn't looking at the scoreboard or listening to strategy discussions. His attention was fixed on Lucas, who sat in the front row of the bleacher section wearing a t-shirt that read Team Ethan in magic marker letters. The boy's face glowed with pride, but behind the excitement, Ethan could see something else: anticipation. Lucas was waiting for his father to attempt something that everyone said was impossible. "What's the most you think I can pull today?" Ethan asked Marcus. The old powerlifter studied him for a long moment, taking in his relaxed posture, the way he'd moved through his previous attempts, the confidence that had replaced the desperate uncertainty of his early training days. "Honestly, 275, maybe 280 if everything goes perfect. Your technique is solid, your speed off the floor is good, but that's a big jump from your training max." Ethan turned to Dr. Mendez. "What do you think?" "I think," she said slowly, "that you didn't come here to play it safe. But I also think you need to be smart about this. What does success look like to you today?" The question cut straight to the heart of everything. Success could be 260 pounds and a guaranteed medal, proof that his training had worked and his goals were achievable. Success could be 275 pounds and a validation that he was capable of more than anyone, including himself, had believed possible. Or success could be something else entirely. "I want to call for 300 pounds, Ethan said quietly. The silence that followed was profound. Marcus blinked. Dr. Mendez opened her mouth and closed it again, and even the ambient noise of the competition seemed to fade. 300 pounds was a massive jump from his previous attempt, the kind of increase that separated good lifts from career-defining moments. "That's," Marcus began. "Impossible," Dr. Mendez finished. "Ethan, that's a 55-pound jump. Even elite lifters don't make jumps like that in competition." "I know the numbers," Ethan said, "but this isn't about the numbers anymore." He gestured toward the crowd, toward Lucas specifically, but also toward the dozen other families scattered throughout the bleachers. People who had come to witness something rare. Ordinary individuals pushing against the boundaries of what seemed possible. "Everyone in this building knows my story," he continued. "They know about the accident, about the doctor saying I'd never walk properly again, about the goal that seemed completely insane when I first mentioned it. If I lift 260 or even 275, they'll applaud politely and go home thinking it was nice that the disabled guy found a hobby." Marcus started to object, but Ethan held up a hand. "But if I attempt 300 pounds, if I actually try for something that everyone agrees is impossible, then it becomes something different. It becomes proof that impossible is just a word people use when they're scared to try." "And if you miss?" Dr. Mendez asked gently. Ethan looked at Lucas again, saw the absolute faith in his son's eyes, the certainty that his father was capable of anything he set his mind to. "Then I miss attempting something extraordinary instead of succeeding at something safe. And my son learns that the trying matters more than the outcome." The conversation was interrupted by the announcement of his final attempt. Marcus and Dr. Mendez exchanged a look that contained volumes of professional concern and personal understanding. They had watched him transform from a broken man attempting 45 pounds into someone capable of considering 300. They had seen the work, witnessed the progress, understood the deeper meaning of what he was attempting. "Your call," Marcus said finally, "but if we're doing this, we're doing it right. No rushing, no second-guessing. You go out there and pull like you've been pulling 300 pounds your whole life." The walk to the platform felt like traveling through water, each step deliberate and strange. The spotters loaded the bar with more weight than Ethan had ever attempted, the plates stacking up until the bar itself seemed to sag under the load. 300 pounds. The number that had started as pure fantasy and somehow evolved into the defining test of everything he'd become. Lucas was on his feet in the bleachers, clapping with the rhythm of a drum beat. Other spectators had noticed the weight on the bar, the murmur of conversation rising as people realized what they were about to witness. A man in a wheelchair attempting to deadlift 300 pounds. It was either going to be inspiring or heartbreaking, and no one seemed sure which. "Strength isn't just about muscles," Lucas had explained to a friend who was being bullied for wearing glasses. "My dad taught me that. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is help someone else." The competition trophy sat on their mantel at home, a modest thing that looked almost insignificant next to the family photos and Lucas's school awards. But its presence had transformed their living room into something that felt less like a museum to Ethan's former life, and more like the foundation for whatever came next. Visitors no longer looked at him with the careful pity reserved for broken things. Instead, they asked questions about training, about the competition, about what it felt like to deadlift 300 pounds. "I never thought I'd see anything like that," Mrs. Henderson had said during one of her visits. "The way you just lifted all that weight. It was like watching someone fly." The metaphor was more accurate than she knew. For those few seconds at the top of the lift, Ethan had felt weightless despite holding 300 pounds in his hands. He had transcended the limitations of his body not by ignoring them, but by finding new ways to work within them. Dr. Mendez had been after him to consider coaching other adaptive athletes. "You have something unique to offer," she'd said during their last official therapy session. "Technical knowledge, yes, but more than that. You understand what it's like to have to completely reimagine what your body can do." The idea had merit. Ethan found himself noticing adaptive athletes in news stories and online videos, studying their techniques and wondering what insights his own journey might offer. But for now, he was content to focus on Lucas and the small community of lifters at Irons who had become something like family. Sarah approached as Lucas finished his final set, toweling chalk from her hands after her own training session. "Kid's got good genetics," she observed. "And better coaching." "He's teaching me as much as I'm teaching him," Ethan replied, watching Lucas carefully rack the weights in their proper places. Marcus insisted that everyone clean up after themselves, regardless of age or ability, and Lucas had embraced the responsibility with characteristic seriousness. The drive home was filled with Lucas's chatter about school, friends, and his plans for increasing his deadlift to 70 pounds by his 11th birthday. The boy had inherited his father's goal-setting nature but applied it with the optimism of someone who had never doubted that improvement was possible. "Dad," Lucas said as they pulled into their driveway, "do you think you'll ever try to lift 500 pounds? The question no longer carried the weight it once had. 500 pounds had been a number chosen more for its impossibility than its significance. A way of proving that he could reclaim something from the wreckage of his accident. But 300 pounds in competition had provided all the proof he needed that strength could be redefined, rather than just recovered. "Maybe someday," Ethan said. "But you know what I realized? The number doesn't matter as much as I thought it did." "What matters?" Ethan looked at his son, this remarkable boy who had watched his father transform from broken to whole, without ever losing faith in the outcome. Lucas had learned lessons about persistence, about the difference between giving up and adapting, about what it meant to support someone through their darkest moments. Those lessons would serve him far longer than any specific weight lifted or record achieved. "What matters is that we keep trying to get stronger," Ethan said. "Not just our muscles, but everything, our minds, our hearts, our ability to help other people. The lifting is just one way to practice." Inside the house, Lucas immediately went to the refrigerator to update his training log, carefully recording his lifts in the notebook they kept magneted beside his old Superdad drawing. The stick figure still smiled from his position behind the barbell, but now he had company. A smaller stick figure standing beside him, chalk on his hands, and determination in his crayon-drawn expression. "100." Ethan transferred to the competition bench and studied the bar. The weight looked heavy, imposing like a challenge issued by physics itself. But it also looked possible in a way that would have been unimaginable 6 months ago. His body had adapted, grown stronger, learned to compensate for its limitations in ways that transcended simple muscle development. "Same setup," he whispered to himself, approaching the bar with the ritual precision that had become second nature. Feet positioned, hands set with his preferred grip width, shoulders over the bar. He could feel the weight before he even began the pull, the density of it transmitting through the metal into his hands. The crowd fell silent. Even the other competitors stopped their warm-ups to watch, drawn by the drama of the moment. In the sudden quiet, Ethan could hear his own heartbeat, feel the familiar tension in his core as he prepared to demand everything his body could give. He thought of Lucas's question, "Will you ever be strong again?" He thought of the whispered conversations, the word useless that had followed him home from grocery stores and diners. He thought of Dr. Mendez's cautious hope, Marcus's gruff encouragement, the community of lifters who had accepted him not as a curiosity, but as one of their own. Most of all, he thought of the drawing taped to his refrigerator, a stick figure in a wheelchair, lifting a barbell over his head, smiling like it was the most natural thing in the world. Ethan took a breath, braced his core, and pulled. The bar broke off the floor. Not easily, not smoothly, but it moved. The weight tracked up his shins, past his knees, demanding everything he had learned about leverage and technique in the application of force through compromised mechanics. His legs trembled with the effort of providing a stable base, his back burned with the load, and his grip fought against 300 pounds of unforgiving iron. At the top of the movement, he stood as tall as his seated position allowed, holding the weight for the brief eternity required by competition rules. The judges studied his position, evaluating lockout and balance and the dozen technical requirements that separated a good lift from a legal one. 3 white lights. The explosion of sound from the crowd was immediate and overwhelming. People were on their feet, cheering not just for the successful lift but for what it represented. The refusal to accept limitations as permanent. The stubborn insistence that strength could be redefined and reclaimed. But all Ethan could hear was one voice rising above the rest, clear and joyful and absolutely certain. "That's my dad." Lucas was jumping up and down in the bleachers, his Team Ethan shirt askew, his face radiant with vindicated faith. And in that moment, Ethan understood that he had answered his son's question completely, not just about strength, but about resilience, about the courage to attempt impossible things, about what it meant to be a father worth looking up to. He had deadlifted 300 pounds, but more importantly, he had shown his son that the word impossible was just another weight to be lifted. 3 months after the competition, Ethan found himself back at irons on a Tuesday evening, but this time he wasn't alone. Lucas knelt beside a loaded barbell, his small hands positioned exactly where his father had taught him, his face scrunched in concentration as he prepared to deadlift 60 pounds, more than half his own body weight. "Remember what we talked about," Ethan said quietly, his wheelchair positioned where he could spot and encourage. "Chest up, shoulders back. The bar wants to stay close to your body." Lucas nodded seriously, took a breath and pulled. The weight came up smoothly, his form nearly perfect despite the relative heaviness of the load. When he set it down with control, his face split into a grin that reminded Ethan powerfully of his own feeling that first day he'd managed to move 45 pounds. "That looked strong, buddy." "Did you see that, Mr. Marcus?" Lucas called to the gym owner, who was working with another lifter across the platform. Marcus glanced over and nodded approvingly. "Form's getting better. Keep that up and you'll be stronger than your old man someday." The prediction made Lucas beam with pride, though Ethan suspected the boy was already stronger than he'd ever been, just in ways that couldn't be measured in pounds and plates. The confidence Lucas had gained, watching his father rebuild himself, had translated into fearlessness in other areas of his life. His grades had improved, he'd joined the school's track team, and he'd developed a reputation among his classmates for defending other kids who got picked on. That evening, after Lucas had gone to bed, Ethan sat in his living room and allowed himself to reflect on the journey that had brought him here. The man he'd been before the accident was gone, and there was no point in mourning him anymore. That man had been strong in simple, straightforward ways that required no creativity or adaptation. He had lifted heavy things because his body was designed for it, loved his son because it came naturally, provided for his family because the path was clear and obvious. This new version of himself had learned more complicated forms of strength. He had figured out how to love his son from a position of vulnerability rather than authority. He had discovered that providing for his family meant more than bringing home a paycheck. It meant modeling resilience, showing Lucas that setbacks were temporary and that strength could be rebuilt from unexpected materials. His phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Mendez. "Saw Lucas's videos from today's training. Form looks great. You should both be proud." Ethan smiled and typed back, "He's getting strong." "You both are," came the immediate reply. Outside, the spring evening was giving way to the kind of soft darkness that made everything feel possible. Somewhere across town, Marcus was probably locking up irons after another day of watching ordinary people attempt extraordinary things. Dr. Mendez was likely reviewing notes on her other patients. planning treatment strategies that would help them reclaim pieces of themselves they thought were lost forever. And here, in this modest house that had once felt like a prison of limitations, a father and son were building something together. Not just muscle and technique and the ability to move heavy objects, but a shared understanding of what it meant to be strong in a world that too often mistook gentleness for weakness, adaptation for defeat, and love for anything less than the most powerful force in the universe. Tomorrow they would return to irons. Lucas would work on his form, Ethan would continue his own training, and both of them would carry forward the lessons they'd learned about persistence and possibility. The weight on the bar would be whatever they were capable of lifting, no more and no less. But the strength they carried with them, that would be limitless. The end. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.